Montana Territory, August 1874. The baby would not stop crying. Etta Jameson pressed her daughter closer to her chest, her arms aching, her dress damp with sweat and milk and fear. Her boots kicked up dust as she walked fast down the main street of Clearwater, past the mercantile and the post office, past eyes that once smiled at her and now looked through her like she was not there at all, or worse, like she should not be. "Go on, get out of here," someone muttered near the saloon porch. Etta did not look back. She kept walking. Little Willa's face was flushed, her tiny fists balled up under her chin. The baby's skin was the soft brown of her father's tribe Shoshone, kind and proud, and that was all it took. Etta had not even buried him a full month before the whispers began. She had stood over Thomas's grave with her newborn in her arms, and she had known deep down that she would never belong here again, not with a child who looked like Willa. They had not married. There had not been time. She had gone to church last Sunday, just like always, but the pews around her had emptied. The preacher had cleared his throat and read the sermon with his eyes anywhere but hers, and when she had walked out, someone had spat near her boots. Now she was walking nowhere, no place to go. No one to go to. Her late father's cabin sat 15 miles out, on dry land no one had touched since he died. She could try for it. She had no horse, only the pack on her back and the baby. It would take all day and half the night, and she had barely enough food for herself, let alone a child. But it was that or sleep on the dirt behind the livery. She turned toward the edge of town. Her arms trembled. Willa cried louder. Someone stepped in front of her. Etta startled, clutching the baby tight. The man was tall, lean, with sun-browned skin and a dust-covered hat slung low over his face. He had been coming out of the feed store, arms full of saddle leather and rope. He set it all down slow, hands open. "You all right, miss?" he asked. Etta stared at him. Most men walked the other way when they saw her. She had not heard a kind voice in weeks. She glanced past him, wary. "I'm fine." "You do not look fine," I said. "I am." The man studied her, then the baby. His eyes lingered, not with disgust, but something else, thought. He had sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it knew silence better than words. Willa hiccuped. "You heading somewhere?" he asked. "I do not need help." I did not offer any. That caught her off guard. He stepped aside like he meant to let her pass. But then he added, "It is hot. And you are walking with a baby like you are running from something." "I am not," she said, too fast. "I am going to my father's place." "Where's that?" "North, near Split Rock." "That is half a day, easy." "I know." He looked at her again. "You planning to carry her the whole way?" Etta swallowed. Her arms ached so bad she could hardly feel her fingers. She shifted the baby higher. "That is my business," he nodded. Then, like it was no big thing, he picked up his gear and said, "Name's Yale Trenton. My horse is tied out back. I'll ride with you if that's fine." "I did not ask you to." "I know." "Why would you do that?" He paused. "Because I do not like how they looked at you back there." Etta blinked. "I was in the saloon when you passed," he added. "Heard what that man said." "That is not right." She looked down at Willa. The baby had stopped crying, her eyes wide and watery. She was watching Yale. Etta sighed. "You got food?" He smiled soft. "Plenty." She nodded once. "Then I will take the company." They rode out together by late afternoon. Yale had a sturdy black gelding named River, and he lifted Etta and Willa up first before climbing on behind. He kept respectful space, holding the reins steady, not crowding her. "Cabin still standing?" he asked. "Last I saw." "Roof leaks, but it is dry inside." "You got anyone left?" No, Yale did not press. They rode in quiet for a long while, the sun hanging low and orange behind them. Willa slept curled against Etta's chest. "Her name?" Yale finally asked. "Willa. She is beautiful." Etta's throat tightened. She had not heard anyone say that out loud yet, not since she was born. "Thank you," she whispered. They reached the cabin just after dark. Etta climbed down stiffly, her knees weak. Yale struck a fire outside while she made sure the place was still safe, dusty, spiderwebbed, but standing. He handed her a tin cup of coffee and some dried meat. She fed Willa first, then herself. Yale leaned back against a tree, watching fireflies spark in the shadows. "You married her father?" he asked quietly. "No, he waited. I wanted to," she said. "But he was gone before we had the chance." Yale nodded slow. "People around here forget their own sins real fast," he said after a moment. "They look at a child and only see what they want to see." Etta looked at him. And what do you see? He met her eyes. I see a mother doing everything she can. She swallowed hard. They stayed 3 days. Yale helped patch the roof and repair the old barn door. He brought fresh water from the creek, taught her how to set snares for rabbits, stacked firewood along the cabin wall. He did not talk much, but he was always there. Willa took to him quickly, her tiny fingers grabbing at his suspenders, her laugh loud in the quiet woods. On the 3rd night, Etta stood by the fire, rocking Willa back to sleep. Yale stepped beside her. Town will not take you back, he said. I know. I have a ranch east of here, about 20 miles, got a spare room, and no one to answer to but God. She looked at him, heart racing. I do not want your pity. You do not have it. Then why? Yale looked down at Willa, then up at Etta. Because if they will not claim you, he said, quiet, steady, then she is ours now. Etta's breath caught. He stepped closer, careful. His hand brushed hers. I am not afraid of what people say. I am not afraid of her father's blood. I am only afraid of walking away from this and regretting it the rest of my life. Etta's eyes filled. She did not speak, only leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his chest. Yale wrapped his arms around her, gentle and sure. Willa slept between them. The fire crackled. And for the first time in weeks, Etta felt safe. The wagon was old, but the wheels held true. Yale stood at the head of the team, adjusting the traces while Etta checked the last of the flour sacks. Willa lay swaddled in a cracked willow cradle, tucked under the shade of the porch. Etta had lined it with dried moss and the softest of the old linens she'd found in a trunk beneath the bed. The child stirred but didn't cry. You sure you want to haul all that? Yale asked, glancing toward the copper kettle she'd wedged beside the dry goods. Etta tied off the last bundle. It was my mother's. He gave a slow nod and offered no argument. The sun hadn't yet cleared the pine line when they left the cabin behind. Etta didn't look back. The land had given her a place to bear her grief, to steady her legs again, but it had never been home, not truly, not without Thomas. The road east narrowed into a game trail after a while, the wagon bumping over tree roots and dry creeks. Yale walked beside the team, one hand steady on the lead horse's bridle, the other on the rifle slung over his shoulder. Etta rode up front with Willa in her arms, careful to keep the baby shaded beneath her shawl. It's not much of a ranch, he said without looking over, but the land's sound. Got 2 milk cows, 3 hens, and a barn that leaks on the east side. Etta shifted Willa slightly. What do you raise? Mostly fence posts. His mouth tugged slightly, but not with humor. Used to run cattle before the fever took half my stock. She studied him. You manage it alone, I did. He paused. I had a brother. He passed through Fort Benton last spring, caught something bad and took it back with him. I buried him beside the old cottonwood. Etta didn't speak. Loss hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. They camped that night near a stream. Yale pitched the canvas lean-to while Etta fed Willa from a dampened rag soaked in warmed milk. She hadn't expected him to bring a cradle board, but he had, wrapped in oilskin and strapped tight to the wagon under the oats. It had belonged to a neighbor's wife, he said, a Shoshone woman who died in childbirth 3 winters back. The board had been stored in the loft ever since. Etta ran her fingers over the beadwork stitched along the edges. You knew her, he nodded, squatting beside the fire. Her name was Naya. She used to hum while she ground corn. My brother was sweet on her for a time, but she only had eyes for her husband. Good woman. Willa stirred in her sleep. She would have liked that it's being used again, he added. Etta set the cradleboard beside her. Not many around here talk about her like that. Then they didn't know her. His voice carried a quiet certainty, the kind built from truth worn smooth over time. The wind picked up a little after dark, rustling through the scrub. Yale kept the fire low, feeding it only what it needed. Etta wrapped Willa in the cradleboard and laid her in the hollow between their bedrolls. You think they'll come looking? She asked after a while, her voice low. Who? Townfolk, the sheriff, that preacher. They had their chance to help you. They didn't take it. He reached over and adjusted the edge of the blanket over Willa's legs. Far as I'm concerned, they gave you up. She lay back slowly. You didn't. No, he said. I didn't. The silence between them was not heavy. It stretched and settled like a coat worn for warmth. They reached Yale's land mid-morning 2 days later. The house stood near a low ridge built from river stone and cottonwood timber. The front porch sagged a little, and the barn roof had 3 missing shingles, but the fences were straight, and the soil looked dark and rich. Etta stepped down from the wagon, Willa pressed against her chest. Yale carried the last of the supplies toward the porch, then turned back. "House gets cold at night," he said. "I'll sleep in the barn till we fix the chimney flue." She frowned. "I didn't come to put you out of your own bed. It's not about that." He met her eyes. "I want you to know I mean this honest, no pressure, no expectations." Etta glanced down at Willa. The child blinked slowly, her breath even. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly. Yale stepped closer, the sun behind his hat brim. "I'm not trying to be." She studied his face, the faint lines around his eyes, the steadiness in the way he stood. Then she nodded once, "All right." He looked relieved but said nothing more. That evening, Etta stood in the doorway of the house, watching as Yale poured water over the porch steps to wash away the dust. Willa slept in the cradleboard beside the hearth, soot smudging the stone above her head. The wind carried the smell of smoke and turned earth. "You ever think about marrying?" she asked, her voice carrying out into the dusk. Yale didn't look up right away. When he did, he wiped his hands on a rag and met her gaze. "I used to. And now I think about what kind of man I want to be. Not just for myself." She stepped outside, the porch boards warm beneath her feet. "I don't need saving," she said. "I know. But I wouldn't mind building something with someone who sees her as I do." He nodded once. "I see her," he said, "and I see you." She looked down, then back at him. "Then come inside. It's getting cold." Yale followed without hesitation. The first frost came quiet, silvering the porch rails and stiffening the soil before dawn. Etta wrapped Willa in a flannel shawl and stepped outside, her breath pluming as she crossed to the chicken coop. The hens clucked low in their roost, feathers puffed, and she scattered feed with one hand while the other held Willa snug against her hip. Behind her, the barn door creaked open. Yale emerged with his coat collar turned up, a bucket of water in one hand and the other holding a small shovel. He nodded toward her but didn't speak, just moved past to check the trough where the ice had skimmed over. "I think the chimney'll hold if we pack more clay around the flue," he said after a moment, straightening. Etta shifted Willa's weight. "You want to try today, if there's time before dusk?" She hesitated, then asked, "Do you want help with the cattle first?" He glanced at her, then gave a small nod. "There's a heifer that's been limping. I'd take the company." By mid-morning, Willa was asleep in the cradleboard, hung safely by the hearth near the stove's warmth. Etta followed Yale out to the back pasture, boots crunching over frostbitten grass. The sun had begun to melt the ice, enough that the mud beneath glistened. They found the heifer near the creek line, favoring her left foreleg. Yale crouched beside her, running a calloused hand down the limb, careful and slow. "Stone bruise," he said, brushing off his knee as he stood. "She'll need rest, but she'll keep." Etta watched him a moment. "You ever think about leaving all this?" His gaze followed the slope of the ridge out to the edge of the trees. "Used to. Thought about heading down to Wyoming territory once. My brother wanted to try ranching near Laramie. You didn't go, didn't feel right, leaving this place to wind up in someone else's." She crouched and touched the heifer's flank. The animal didn't flinch. "I didn't picture myself ending up here," she said. "I thought I'd be in Idaho by now. Maybe teaching school." Willa's father had family near Salmon River. Yale waited quiet. "I wrote them," she added. "After he died, sent word about her. Did they answer?" "No." He didn't ask again. By the time they returned to the house, the sun had dipped low. Willa stirred as Yale stepped inside and removed his coat. He crouched beside the cradleboard, murmured something too quiet to hear, and lifted her gently into his arms. Etta watched from the doorway. His ease with her daughter wasn't practiced. It came from some instinct that didn't need teaching. "She's warm to you," she said. "She's got a strong heart," he replied. "Takes to what's good." Etta leaned against the door frame. "You think you'll always want a quiet life?" He adjusted Willa in the crook of his arm and looked up. "Not always. But I want this one now." Her throat tightened, but she stepped forward. Yale stood, and for a long moment they just stood there, Willa between them, watching the light shift across the floorboards. "Do you believe in second beginnings?" she asked. "If I didn't, I'd still be sleeping in a cold barn." She reached for Willa. Their hands brushed as she took the child, and neither pulled back right away. "I want to stay," she said softly, "but not as someone passing through." Yale's voice was low. "Then stay as someone who's claimed." She looked up at him. "You mean that?" "I haven't meant anything more." The wind outside picked up, rattling the window panes. Etta reached for his hand, and when he took it, it felt like something long missing had returned to its rightful place. That night, after the lamps were lowered and Willa slept in the basket beside their bed, Etta lay beneath the quilts with Yale beside her, the warmth of his shoulder brushing hers. She turned toward him. "We'll raise her together," he met her eyes. "She's ours now." And that was the last thing said before the hush of winter settled around them, not with fear, but with something whole. A thin mist clung to the earth the morning Yale took Etta out to the south field. He carried Willa in the crook of one arm, the child bundled in a wool shirt tied around her like a sling. Etta followed with a canvas satchel over her shoulder, glancing up as the fog lifted in slow curls off the grass. The frost had melted in patches, revealing the dark, pliant soil beneath. "You ever planted anything?" Yale asked, setting Willa gently into a basket lined with a horse blanket. Etta knelt beside the child, tucking the edges in. "Only window herbs. My mother grew dill in jars. I used to think the smell of it meant everything was going to be all right." He set down the hand plow and rolled up his sleeves. "This ground hasn't been worked in 2 years. I figure potatoes first." "They won't ask much of it." Etta took the other handle, her boots sinking in as she leaned into the weight. The plow blade split the topsoil with a groan, and Yale steadied it from behind. "You sure you want to do this now?" he asked. "We'll have to eat come spring." "Might as well earn it." They didn't speak much after that. The work was slow, but the rhythm steadied her. The sun broke fully by mid-morning, casting long shadows across the furrows. Willa dozed between them, a curl of dark hair stuck to her cheek. Etta straightened and wiped her brow with her cuff. "You ever think about what comes next?" Yale looked up from where he was sharpening the hoe. "What do you mean? Not just the farm, us, this?" He was quiet a moment, then stood. "I've been thinking we ought to marry," she blinked. "Well, that's plain. I don't see the point in dancing around it. You're here, I want you here, I want her here, and I want it to be right." Etta lowered herself onto the edge of the basket, careful not to wake Willa. "And if I said no, I'd still build you a home. But I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't carry the want of it." She watched a hawk wheel slow above the ridge before speaking again. "You'd take a preacher out here for it," he nodded. "I'd ride to Lewistown if I had to." She looked down at her hands, dirt under her nails, skin chapped from the wind. "I never pictured a wedding like that." "How did you picture it?" She smiled faintly. "I didn't, not really, just thought there'd be someone who didn't flinch when they saw her." Yale stepped close and crouched beside the basket. He touched Willa's tiny foot, barely a whisper of pressure. She was never the thing to flinch from. Etta's throat tightened. "I think I'd say yes, if you asked." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a ring wrapped in cloth. "I carved the band from applewood. The stone's a turquoise chip my brother found near the creek. I figured I'd ask when it felt right. You've been holding it this whole time." "I didn't want to rush you." Etta took the ring, running her thumb over the worn grain. "It's beautiful. It's meant to last." She slipped it on. "Then yes." Yale stood, then offered his hand. She rose with him, their fingers laced. Neither smiled wide, but the quiet between them softened. That night, Etta boiled carrots and salt pork in the cast iron pot while Yale read aloud from an old almanac, his voice low, steady. Willa gurgled from the sling tied to Etta's chest, her eyes tracking the flicker of firelight on the wall. When the meal was finished, Etta washed the dishes while Yale sat beside the hearth, mending a split in the cradleboard's rawhide lacing. "You think she'll remember this place?" he asked, not looking up. "She'll remember the way it felt," Etta said. "That's what stays." Willa yawned, her head tipping against Etta's collarbone. Yale set the cradleboard aside. "We'll have the preacher come before snowfall." Etta nodded. "I'll sew a dress from the flour sack cloth. There's enough lace left to trim the sleeves." They didn't speak more of it that night. They didn't need to. The promise had been made, not in bells or parchment, but in the shared work of carving a life from the earth. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the cottonwoods along the creek. Inside, the fire burned low, and the warmth between them held. The preacher arrived 2 weeks before the first snowfall, riding a dun mare with a crooked gait and carrying only a Bible and a rolled wool coat strapped behind the saddle. He nodded solemnly when Yale met him at the fence line and handed over the reins without a word. Etta waited inside, smoothing the worn cotton of her dress with one hand while the other kept Willa steady on her hip. Yale stepped in first, brushing snow from his shoulders. The preacher followed, his cheeks windburned, eyes clear. He looked to be in his 50s, with a beard gone mostly gray and hands worn from more than scripture. "You the ones asked me west?" he asked. "That's right," Yale said. "We're ready." The preacher gave a quiet nod, unfastened his coat, and looked around the room. "You've made a good place here." Etta shifted Willa to her other arm and offered a seat near the stove. "Would you like coffee before we begin?" He settled onto the bench. "I won't say no." They didn't speak much while the pot boiled. Willa cooed softly, reaching for the steam with one hand before curling back into her mother's chest. When the cups were filled and passed, the preacher drank deeply, then set his cup down. "Do you have vows prepared?" he asked. Yale stood beside Etta, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. "Only the truth." The preacher nodded, opened his Bible, and read a passage low and steady. When he finished, he looked to Yale. "I take her as mine," Yale said, voice even. "To build with, to stand beside, to see through every season." Etta didn't look away. "And I take him. Not for rescue and not for shelter, but for what we've grown in this place together." The preacher closed his book, reached for a small slip of folded paper, and signed it with a fountain pen drawn from a leather case. "You'll need 2 witnesses." Yale pulled a folded letter from the mantel. "Neighbors from the next bluff over. They'll sign and post it in town this week." The preacher tucked the paper away, finished his coffee, and rose. "Then by law of the territory and witness of God, you are husband and wife." No one spoke for a moment. Willa stirred, blinking up at them. Yale reached for her, lifting her gently into his arms. "She's fussing," he said. Etta stepped closer and touched the child's cheek. "She's not sure what's changed." "Everything," Yale said, his voice soft, "and nothing at all." They saw the preacher off by mid-afternoon, the mare's hoofbeats muffled by the snow. Etta stood at the fence line until he disappeared behind the ridge, then turned back toward the house. Yale reached for her hand, and they walked the rest of the way side by side. That night, after Willa had been settled in her basket and the fire had burned to embers, Etta sat at the table, a small tin box open before her. Inside lay a bundle of letters bound in twine, none of them opened. "They never wrote back," she said, not looking up. Yale leaned against the post beside the hearth. "You want to try again?" She shook her head. "I needed to ask, that's all." He crossed the room, knelt beside her, and rested a hand over hers. "You have a place here. Not because you were turned away, but because you chose it." She brushed her thumb over the top of his hand. "And I choose it still." They rose together, the tin box left closed on the table. By spring, the field had taken root. Willa had begun walking, her feet unsteady but eager. She chased chickens with a shriek of laughter that sent feathers skyward and left Yale shaking his head as he mended the garden fence. Etta planted dill in a window box above the sink, the scent of it strong in the morning light. One late afternoon, as Yale returned from the creek with his boots soaked and his shirt clinging to his back, he found Etta standing barefoot in the grass with Willa on her hip. The sun was low, gold spilling over the ridge, and the child was laughing full and free as Etta spun her in slow, wide circles. Yale stopped short, watching them. Etta turned toward him, her dress twirling at her knees. "You're late." River spooked at a muskrat. "Took me into the mud. Serves you right for riding past supper." He stepped closer and kissed her cheek, tasting salt and sun. "You look like joy." She met his eyes. "I feel like home." As the sun dipped behind the trees, they walked back toward the house together, the scent of wood smoke rising in the cooling air. Etta carried Willa, and Yale carried the last of the fish from the creek, and the weight between them was not burden, but bond. They built a life slowly, in fence posts and furrows, in threadbare quilts and quiet mornings. They spoke little of the past, not because it didn't matter, but because it had shaped them and then passed on like a spring flood that left good soil behind. Willa grew strong, her world rooted in the sound of her mother's humming and her father's boots on the porch. She learned to walk in the rows between the potatoes and to speak her first words by the hearth where Etta taught her the names of herbs and stars. Yale taught her to ride, to gather eggs without startling the hens, to listen for the wind before the rain came. He carved her toys from pine scraps and carried her on his shoulders when the snow made the world too tall. On their 5th anniversary, Etta gave Yale a new tin cup, hand-etched with his initials. He gave her a journal stitched in deerskin, the first page already filled with her name, Etta Jameson Trenton, and the words, "For all the harvests to come." They grew old together in the way some couples do, slow and steady, with hands worn from work and hearts that never forgot how it had all begun. And when the wind turned cold again and the leaves fell in rust-colored sheets, their home remained warm with the quiet joy of a life rightly chosen. They were not waiting anymore, they were living. Together. Always.